If that suits your fancy, why, I don't see why you can't do it. I've been called in as a substitute tonight because of the illness of the introducer, and will remind you that the meeting tonight is to celebrate the 91st anniversary of the founding of the World Health Organization in 1948. George will tell you a lot about the World Health Organization, but just a few introductory remarks. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It operates on about a $296 million budget. There are 166 member countries, and it is the specialized and autonomous agency for health in the United Nations organization, and reports to the United Nations organization through the Economic and Social Council. To begin the program tonight, we will make an award of the United Nations Association, and Jan Barron will make that award.
We are very pleased to have with us Karen Augustine. Karen is a first prize winner in the United Nations Association Ames Chapter High School Essay Contest. She wrote an essay which was around this situation. She was just elected, I think, President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and she was to give the address that the President of the United Nations Association would give. She wrote her address, she entered the contest, she is the first prize winner in Ames. Her name will be forwarded to the National United Nations Association, and hopefully she will win first prize there. Last year she was one of the 10 finalists, so I think she's going for the top this year.
As you know, our speaker tonight is Dr. George W. Barron, Professor of Veterinary Microbiology and Preventive Medicine. His educational background was he has a DVM degree from Iowa State University, his PhD degree from the University of Kansas, and he's been awarded a Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Silliman University in the Philippines. His career in disease prevention and control began with the U.S. Public Health Service. Then over a 13-year period, he was professor of microbiology at Silliman University and director of the Health Laboratory of Negros Oriental Province in the Philippines. Since 1973, he has been at Iowa State University, where he teaches epidemiology, disease prevention, public health, world food issues, and the history of veterinary medicine. Since 1971, he has been a consultant to the World Health Organization of the United Nations Organization, having served 24 consultantships in 15 countries. He is a member of the expert panel on zoonosis of the World Health Organization. He's been very active in the Ames chapter of the United Nations Association and is a past president. It is my pleasure then to introduce Dr. George Barron to present the program tonight.
Thank you very much, Weldon. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry about the space. I I don't know what I or anyone else can do about it. Well, that may be one of the finest things. It will permit those who were planning to sleep to go into the hall to sleep instead of occupying a chair, and it will, I don't know, short of epidemic disease or threat of epidemic disease, which would cause everyone to head for the nearest door, I don't know what else to do. Oops, I didn't really mean that to go on immediately. There. Disease is ancient. This the old skeletons were animated for just a moment in time again. After 60 million years, suddenly they became alive again. This flop on its sideosaurus and this jump on toposaurus appear to be skeletons because it appears they ate each other up. The bones of the dinosaurs show that they suffered from disease. When mammals made their appearance upon this earth, infectious agents of disease were waiting for them. And the mammoths that have been frozen in the far north of Siberia show a population of bacteria in their digestive tracts and respiratory systems that are almost identical to the mammals of today. They had acid-fast bacilli characteristic of tuberculosis. They had other bacteria in the intestine that looked like the ones of today. I'm hearing myself not as I wish to be heard. Is this working? Is this working okay? Am I too loud for you? All right, there's a lot of people, you'll absorb a lot of sound. And when people came upon the scene, infectious diseases were waiting for them. And this ancient picture or wax facsimile shows one of them there wearing horns of elk, as though he were attempting to ward off the disease that was a part of their life. But epidemic disease is relatively new. It required the concentration of peoples, and it required instability. And Jenner's quotation almost 200 years ago is a very important quote. The deviation of man from, and I would use of women as well, from the state in which he and she were originally placed by nature seems to have proven to them a prolific source of diseases. There will be two important quotations that will appear tonight, and this is one of them. Epidemic disease basically began some, what? Oh no. Epidemic disease basically began some 10,000 years ago as agriculture began and people began to concentrate. Epidemic disease has decimated urban populations, has conquered armies, has disrupted society, and has changed the course of history. Epidemics have ridden the four horses of the apocalypse. They have flowed like lava into the midst of natural disasters. They have been the bitter harvest of famines, and they have wreaked the ultimate disruption upon instability. And so we begin with the age of mystery. And in the mystery of history, Humanity has ever struggled to break out of this cycle and into the age of mastery. And my thesis is that the World Health Organization has a primary responsibility in achieving the age of mastery. On a hill in Athens, Greece, stands the story of greatness. Here, the age of mystery began to have its breakdown, for this is the home of Hippocrates, the father of medicine, who saw in instability the cause of disease. Today, more than 2,000 years later, we realize that he had at least half of the truth, and among the persons who lived here in Athens is the greatest galaxy of imperishable names that are present in our history. All of the intellect of Athens was concentrated here at the Acropolis, and here in 2 generations, democracy and philosophy and art and architecture and tragedy and comedy all came into being, at least 2 grades above that we can boast today. Only genius stood above the general level of the population. In the Acropolis, in its earliest days, this beautiful statue of Athena stood, and the Acropolis remains in ruins today as one of the great structures of history. The countryside around Athens was also well developed, and Athens ruled the entire region. Far to the south was Sparta. It had been only 50 years since Leonidas was defeated at Thermopylae, and just the word Spartan was to invoke a feeling of courage and a recognition that they did not accept defeat. In 430 BC, Sparta began a siege. I'm sorry, I don't understand what's wrong. I think I'm going to have to just take a moment here to get this slide into the right area here. This is the Acropolis as the model of it stood. And would someone just touch the forward on that projector that's on right now and give me the next slide? No, it's the middle one. Just touch the forward button on it. Yes. All right, thank you. I apologize for that. Sparta began the war on the countryside with a 40-day siege in 430 BC. I think the uniforms that they wore were absolutely incredible. And I have no concept of what would happen to war today if people wore uniforms like this. The people, however, fled from the Spartans, and they fled into Athens. The summer was hot and humid, and the crowding was indescribable. And they left the countryside empty. There were about 300,000 people in Athens at this point, and as the people daily poured in, the simplest of sanitation became impossible, and the singing of the children in the evening was changed by the humming of mosquitoes. And then, across the Mediterranean Sea, from the northern part of Egypt, came disease, a terrible plague from North Africa into Athens. Thucydides, the great historian, was in Athens at this time. He became ill, but he recovered. And he left us the record of this great plague. He described the great disorder that took place in the city during what we call the plague of Athens. People died in the temples, in their homes, at the public fountains where they dragged themselves to quench their thirst. The dead lying everywhere, and the dying lying on top of the dead. There was no one to bury them. Their bloody battles were fought for funeral pyres. The disease attacked with equal impartiality the high and the mighty, the geniuses, the low and the humble. And a great disregard for all standards of life and conduct became the reality. Between 430 and 427 BC. And Thucydides said there was no fear of the gods or of the laws of men. There was no one to restrain them, and every kind of licentiousness attacked the population. And Thucydides ruefully recorded that there was no one to stop them. Pericles, the great leader of the Athenians, saw the destruction of his city, and he set out to try to stop the Spartans, and the plague accompanied him and killed many more of his men than did the Spartans. The navy too went out, but half of its sailors were killed by the disease, and they came back. And Lysander, the leader of the Spartans, sailed into the harbor of Piraeus in 427 BC, and to the merry tunes of their flutes they tore down the great walls of Athens, and to the lamentations and wailing of the Athenians. Why did they not get the plague? Why did they not all die as well as the Athenians? They were not stressed. It was the Athenians in the great city that were stressed, and the Spartans were on the edge of the epidemic, and though undoubtedly many died, it never destroyed the Spartan cities or the Spartan army. But Athens lay in the dust, never to rise again in 2,200 years. The identity of the disease hinges on what Thucydides said, and the Greek scholars say that it is unclear when he said the people died like sheep, whether he meant that they died as sheep die, quietly and without a murmur, or whether they died as the sheep also died. And this came forth again in 1977, when again out of the headwaters of the Nile came into Egypt the disease Rift Valley fever. And over 1 million people were infected in 1977 and 1978 in Egypt alone, with a 3% mortality rate. And that isn't very long ago. If the plague of Athens was Rift Valley fever, this is one of the zoonoses, a disease that affects both animals and people. The Black Death, plague, had raged in Asia for centuries. And then, in 1032 BC, it came out of Asia into the Middle East, the very right edge of the slide as you see it there. And the greatest description of this is in the book of 2 Samuel in the Bible, where it describes the tumors and the mice and how the people of Israel made models of the tumors and of the mice to stop the advance of this disease. And this picture here is the artist's conception of what was taking place at Ashdod in 1032 BC. It just has to be that this was the plague. And then, in 1347, it was carried to Messina by a Genoese ship to the northern coast of Sicily. In 1347, the city was almost depopulated, but it did not stop here. Within a year, it spread across Sicily, into Italy, into France, and everywhere the scenes of disaster were repeated. 3/4 to 90% of the people died. The greatest record of this is by Guy de Chauliac, personal physician of the great Pope Clement VI, who described it vividly, both in terms of the bubonic plague with its tumors and in terms of the pneumonic plague with its pneumonia. And his quote here refers to the pneumonic plague, which spreads from one person to another without the involvement of the rats. In Florence, at least 60,000 people died. In Venice, 100,000. It crossed Germany and Holland, and into London, at least 100,000 died. In most of these cities, that represented 90% of the people. And we see the scenes of what was happening as people fled from London during this period. The scenes of terror were repeated everywhere. Burning cities were left behind as the only way to mercifully dispose of the bodies of those who died. The early chroniclers chronicled the gluttony, the immorality, and the gambling, but they also chronicle the acceptance of people. Ring around a rosy, pocket full of posy. The posies in the pocket remove from your nose the smell of the dead bodies that are all around. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The plague physicians wore masks that they put flowers into the beak in an attempt to keep them from smelling the dead bodies. But the physicians were of no help, and they died with all the rest. And the church was powerless to halt it, try as they did. The priests died, and their processions and their relics did not stop the plague. And the pious hope was expressed that when this would end, that people would be filled with love and charity toward each other. And there was great love in the midst of the terror. San Sebastian is one example, a man who recovered from the plague, but the people did not accept him because he had recovered, and he was sentenced to be killed with arrows, and he was shot quietly while accepting it. But he recovered, and he gave the rest of his life then to helping those who had the disease. But the hopes that people would be filled with love and charity toward each other when it was over did not happen. And when it was over, just exactly the opposite. People were fewer, and by hereditary succession they were richer, and much litigation took place, and lawyers appeared for the first time in large numbers. And unquestionably the disease was the plague. It was rat-associated then, and the plague stands ready to come back again. After 5.5 centuries of being in control, it is not yet gone, and Vietnam proved that to us. Influenza has caused periodic epidemics as long as history could record. It was well described by the Egyptian temple physicians. And for those of our nation, it was important at the end of the First World War. The greatest epidemic of influenza took place in the last months of World War I. And it was carried by the soldiers all around the world. And the waves of influenza covered the entire world, reminiscent of the Black Death. The pandemic of 1918-1919 struck at least 1 billion people, over 1/2 of the world's population. In India, at least 12.5 million people died, and over the world, at least 21.6. The U.S. was less affected in terms of numbers of people that died than was true of most parts of the world. In Europe, just recovering from the war, the death rate was horrendous. But even for the United States, at least 10 times as many people died in this pandemic as died during the war. Newsboys wore masks, mass gatherings in schools were abandoned, theaters were closed. Attempts to halt by spraying disinfectant, and the person's just a little bit cut off there, but he is wearing a mask. But it didn't help anyway, so there's no use in seeing it. And it went on without any ability to stop it. An interesting sidelight took place at the Cedar Rapids National Swine Breeders Show on September 30, 1918, when Dr. Cohen of Fort Dodge recognized a disease in swine that had not been seen before. And the virus that caused this disease in swine could not be differentiated from the human virus that caused the 1918-1919 influenza. And so in 1976, once again, we attempted to vaccinate the population of the United States because of a fear of swine flu, and I noticed yesterday that the new vaccine for next year for influenza for people will once again contain the swine flu virus. Just an interesting little sidelight. But you see, attempts to carry on society while they made cartoons in the newspapers did not stop the influenza. My mother taught me that rhyme. During the time when her family had the influenza, only her father didn't get it and was able to take care of the rest of the family. Boy Scouts took food to those who were ill. Court was held in open air. But none of these stopped the disruption that was taking place because of this disease. You see, this soldier here wearing a mask and guarding a palace where peace was being discussed. You see, this disrupted the orderly development of peace at the end of the First World War. And as a nation, we don't realize the extent to which the influenza in Europe and in this country disrupted the orderly development of peace after the First World War. Those who are old enough remember when Wilson sailed to Versailles amid the plaudits of the world and then changed so drastically following his thrombosis and left side paralysis. But the role of flu is not mentioned in all of this. But in actuality, it was flu that caused that disruption at that very critical time and was one of the things that paved the way for the end of peace and the entrance of the Second World War. Our only hope is to change the role of disease through international action. The World Health Action at the beginning of 1967, in about its 20th year, opened one window into the age of mastery and out of the age of mystery. The greatest changes in the course of disease have come when they have come internationally. Our hope is in our one global organization, the World Health Organization. On May 8, 1980, Dr. Al Awadi, signing the document, and Dr. Halfdan Mahler, the Secretary General of the World Health Organization, signed the document that smallpox had been eradicated from the world, a story that we have got to take a look at. The last case of smallpox was on October 1977. It had been an endemic disease present continually in the Eastern Hemisphere. It had come into Europe probably in 164 AD with the returning armies of Marcus Aurelius Antonius, and was called the Antonine Plague, and 16 years later Marcus Aurelius himself died of it. But advertisements in the old newspapers and journals said that for persons to work in the homes, said that they would hire only if you had the scars of smallpox. And until they get over smallpox, parents do not count children as their own. Endemic across the European and Asian continents, it was epidemic in the rim of Asia, and this Japanese drawing, or Japanese artwork, shows the warrior warding off the demon of smallpox. This, we must remember, is still the age of mystery. But when the Europeans invaded this country, we must also realize that it was smallpox that preceded them and killed far more of the American Indians than did the cowboys or any of the American soldiers or any other guns, for that matter, despite what the movies have indicated to us. And then in 1796, Edward Jenner recognized that people that had cowpox did not get smallpox, and in an incredible field trial that would never be permitted today, he vaccinated his son. Taking material from the cowpox of a milkmaid, he inoculated his son, and it worked. His son developed the single pox, and his son went on to show through his life that he was immune. And the system worked, and vaccination with pustules began to become the order of the day. And a letter to Edward Jenner said that future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed and by you has been extirpated. Letter to Edward Jenner, 1806. And then they collected the cowpox virus also from calves, and they used that as the vaccine, and the term vaccinia comes, or the word vaccine comes from this word vaccinia, which comes from vaca, meaning cow. And there was opposition as well as acceptance to it, and there were those who were afraid that cows would grow out on the points where the vaccination was given. And this cartoon shows exactly that, going back into that early day. And then in 1967, the Soviet Union proposed to the World Health Assembly that smallpox eradication be undertaken. There were 4 countries in which it remained endemic: Ethiopia, where this child is being vaccinated, Somalia, India, and Bangladesh. And it was undertaken. And most of the money for this campaign, approximately $98 million, came from our country. And I don't think we realize the importance of that. And when the jeeps got stuck, then people walked. And they went by whatever means they could to where the people were to vaccinate. And among those who were, on the teams that carried the vaccine were a man who lives here in Ames and works at Lutheran Social Services, Ed Rupert. And it was a truly international effort. Over a period of just about a decade, about $98 million were spent, about 70% of it through World Health Organization. About half of the money was matched by funds from the member countries where the program was taking place, and the return on the investment was about 1,250%. And the last case was in October 1977, when Ali Ma'alim, a 23-year-old cook in Somalia, suffered smallpox and did not die. There's Ed Rupert. It would have worked to vaccinate the camel also, for camels also have pox that's very closely related. The virus today remains at 2 centers, one in the Soviet Union in Moscow, and the other one at the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. And approximately 250 million doses of vaccine are in storage for use should they ever be necessary. Of all diseases, rabies strikes terror. It is ever present, yet it is ever hidden, but it is ever emerging. In 1885 BC, not AD, this record in the Sumerian Code. It is one of the earliest well-described diseases, and it was present in the wild long before it was present in dogs. It struck terror to the Romans. However brave were their soldiers. It struck terror in the Middle Ages, and there was much superstition associated with it. And the first effective means of control was by cauterizing the wound of a rabid dog with a red-hot iron. And some of the irons that were used are in the upper part of the picture, and one of them is in the flames there. And that man, with that kind of stoicism, accepting a red-hot iron against his leg, is an absolute source of amazement to me. But when you consider the alternatives, perhaps stoicism is possible. And it was in rabies that human and animal medicine came together, not through a physician and not through a veterinarian, but through a chemist, Louis Pasteur, who developed the first vaccine against rabies. And though the vaccine has been modified in the years since, the principle has not, and it is a vaccine that has worked and has made it possible in this country, Canada, and Europe to essentially remove the scourge of rabies from dogs. But rabies is present in other animals as well. In Europe, it is principally in the fox that rabies is a serious problem. And it has been through the work of the World Health Organization that a vaccine to protect foxes by oral immunization with a bait dropped from a helicopter or many helicopters has worked. And today we are at the threshold of a vaccine that is going to be field tried in the very near future for vaccinating raccoons orally. Raccoons are the principal animals that host rabies in the eastern part of the United States. Perhaps the day will come that we will also have a vaccine to vaccinate skunks, for they are the principal host of rabies in this part of the United States. But it is not yet. And in the meantime, about 50,000 people die of rabies each year. One of the most horrible deaths to have to die from. I have watched 18 people die of rabies, and I would put it at the bottom of the list. But for most of the world, it is the dog that remains the source of rabies for people. And it is the dog that strikes terror for most people of the world. And all of the area shown in black there is area in which rabies is present in dogs. And efforts have been made on a world basis to stop rabies in dogs for decades, and they have attempted to use the methods that work in the western part of the world, and they have not worked. Attempts to halt rabies in the developing countries of the world by restraining the dogs so that they don't come in contact with each other sounds so simple to us, but it has not worked in the developing countries of the world where the dogs could not be restrained. And removal of those dogs that are not restrained means that dogs have to be restrained. And if dogs are not restrained, then what are you going to remove? Everything? And it has not worked. It has in the West, but it has not worked here. And attempts to go out in the pre-dawn hours and throw out baits of strychnine to dogs and to poison them in the streets and to rush away before the people wake up and start shooting at you have not worked either. It's not easy to get a picture in the pre-dawn hours as a bait is being thrown out and you are trying to get out of the way in a hurry. So I have no good picture. But vaccination has been difficult, though it has worked. It is difficult when people do not have the money to pay for it, when there is no collar on the dog to attach a tag. And so I look to the World Health Organization, which has moved into rabies control in a different way, by beginning with ecological study of the dogs themselves and why the dogs are at the population they are, and what is the interaction of the dogs and what is their interaction with people. And they have sent out people in 3 pilot projects, one in Ecuador, one in Tunisia, and one in Sri Lanka, to study the dogs and how they maintain rabies. And the dogs are basically there because there is garbage for those dogs to eat, and the dogs eat that garbage because there's no one else to dispose of it. And the dogs also are there because there is harborage where they can have their puppies. And this has been learned by interviewing throughout the cities. In the high class, for rabies is principally an urban disease in the developing countries, and in the lower classes as well, for it is necessary to reach the dogs wherever they are. And vaccination on a house-to-house basis, provided by government, and something new in vaccination, and that is the capturing of those dogs that there is no one to hold, and to vaccinate them and then to release them.